to the Welcome everyone to the Sumer Sports Show. Normally the show is hosted by Eric Eager and Thomas Dimitrov, but with them in Glendale on Radio Row, the reins have been handed to myself, Tej Seth, and to my colleague and co-host today, Parker Fleming, as guest host for this week. Parker, how are you doing?
I am doing great, man. We are just here on the eve of the Super Bowl. I don't know about you, but I got a lot of adrenaline from watching the 7-on-7 yesterday. So it definitely did not scratch my football itch, and I'm excited for us to have one more game and to break it down between two interesting and kind of different, if I may lead into what we're going to say a little bit, different teams. So yeah, pretty excited for the show. Glad that while Thomas and Eric are off doing important things, we get to kind of take over the ship, as it were.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, like you mentioned, these 2 weeks basically without football, I don't think we can count the 7-on-7 that happened this past weekend. It kind of gets long. So a lot of the things that are said are kind of repeated, I feel like. And we wanted to approach this show from a different perspective. So, we're going to be doing this on the Sumer Sports YouTube and through the Sumer Sports Twitter account at Sumer Sports as well. So be sure to check that out if not already. But we're going to be looking at these teams from a macro view and break down what roster moves they've made to get to the spot where they're playing each other in the Super Bowl. And I think it's really interesting to look at a lot of the things that the general managers of these teams, Howie Roseman and Brett Veach, have done to get to the spot where they're playing for their second Super Bowl each for both of them. So let's kick it off with the Eagles. What are some kind of your thoughts on the way that they built this roster to get here?
Yeah, so in keeping with the macro perspective, I'm totally going to hijack this and just ask you. You've seen this question that's kind of been going around Twitter. Um, did the Eagles have an easy path? Like, we're almost some kind of sense of, oh, the Eagles don't deserve to be in the Super Bowl, or I think they're fake because the schedule and the path that they had was easy. So before we dive into the specific roster, which I think we absolutely should, I want to get your perspective on that just generally. Like, the Eagles, they're the 1 seed. They got to play the Giants 3 times in the last 6 weeks of the season, which is super helpful if you're trying to win games, right? What do you think, Tej? Are the Eagles overrated? Did they have an easy path? Did they kind of backdoor into the Super Bowl?
Yeah, this is a great question and something that I thought about a lot. And I think that the Eagles aren't overrated necessarily because all their underlying metrics are really, really good, right? Like, if you look at their spread value that you can take from kind of getting the spreads throughout the year to kind of see how much the betting markets think of them, they're worth 7.5 points better than an average team on a neutral field. Their point differential was third best in the league behind the 49ers and Bills. Their Pythagorean wins was 11.6, which was also third best in the league. So I think even though they might have had an easier path relative to teams that have made the Super Bowl before, I don't think they're necessarily overrated just because of that easy path, because a lot of their underlying metrics are great and their roster is phenomenal, like we're going to talk about.
Just as an aside, I saw them last game against the 49ers. Once Johnson came in and things kind of started unraveling for the 49ers, they were still running Jalen Hurts. And I kind of thought maybe you could maximize your advantage here by not taking additional hits and wear and tear on your star players while you have a big lead here. But yeah, okay. So let's talk about this roster. Tej, a couple years ago, Eagles were second worst quarterback EPA per play, and they were 4-11-1, one tie. Feels like a pretty quick turnaround to get to the Super Bowl after being there. How did they do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's crazy to kind of come back to the Super Bowl 5 years after being in it with a totally different quarterback and head coach than you had before. Usually we see these repeat Super Bowl participants have the same quarterback and head coach. We think about the Seahawks teams, obviously the Patriots teams, and then the Chiefs here. And I think it really starts with what the Eagles have on their offensive line. And when you look at where they've gotten these pieces, it's really interesting to see kind of a mix of younger talent being infiltrated in there while you have some older cornerstones. So at their left tackle position, Jordan Mailata, 7th round pick in 2018 from Australia. And what I think was interesting about him was he was drafted through the International Player Pathway Program. And that allows NFL rosters to hold an extra spot on their roster for an international player, part of this program. So he could go throughout his first training camp as a 7th round rookie, not counting on the roster spot for the Eagles. So it let them maybe keep him around longer. And he got developed into one of the best left tackles in football this year, only taking up 1.9% of their cap because they got to his extension earlier as well once they realized the talent that he was. And then in the middle, you have Jason Kelce, who is probably the best center in football, 6th round pick in 2011, 5 All-Pros in 12 seasons. And in 2017, he was again the best center in football. And we saw a slight dip from his performance these past couple seasons, but that might have been affected by Carson Wentz's play. And now he's returned to probably being the best center in the league. And then at right tackle, Lane Johnson, number 4 overall pick in 2013, very highly drafted and plays at a high level as well. So it's kind of cool to see these 2 holdovers like Kelce and Lane Johnson from the previous Super Bowl roster, as well as someone new like Jordan Mailata really hold up this Eagles offensive line.
Absolutely. And I don't think it's an overstatement to say that Jeff Stoutland is a pretty great offensive line coach. And I think it's an interesting kind of open question, given the quarterback turnover, given the entire offensive scheme turnover, given that he's brought in a couple new guys, but they still have, on this roster, guys like Lane Johnson, who was drafted in 2013, and Dickerson was drafted in 21. So you've got kind of a mix of like old and new. I feel like it's no small task to integrate kind of your established veterans, your new guys, while you're transitioning this offense entirely as well. So certainly an impressive job there. If we look at total pressure allowed this season, they have done a good job of giving Jalen Hurts time to throw, and I don't want to spoil kind of our excuse me, I don't want to spoil our talking about quarterbacks later, but just saying giving Jalen Hurts a little breathing room has gone a long way. 30.1% of his dropbacks were under pressure, which is 10th in the nation. I say in the nation because I'm used to college football. 10th in the league. His time to throw 3.8 is 8th, tied with Kenny Pickett, but just behind Patrick Mahomes, right there in the top as well. So even when he is getting pressured, the offensive line is working on how do we kind of make those secondary blocks? How do we extend the play? How do we know? One thing you see in college, I feel like with a bad offensive line is if a quarterback can extend the play, you'll get a lot of holding penalties because the offensive lineman won't be aware of how dynamic your quarterback is and him moving around. And so the offensive line having that ability to, limit pressures, but then also extend the play, let those routes develop without incurring those penalties as Hurts is, scrambling around doing all that crazy stuff, is really, really important as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely agree. You can take Parker off the college football shows, but you can't take college football out of Parker there. So I like the In the Nation mention. But like another thing to mention about this offensive line is like drafting Cam Jurgens this past year when you're kind of planning for life without Jason Kelce is like what these smart organizations do, because the Eagles knew they had the infrastructure in place to kind of make this work where they didn't have to draft players that had to be starting day one this season because of how stacked their roster was. And like, there's the interview with Jason Kelce after the draft where he said he was a part of the process to draft someone like Cam Jurgens. So like, that's really cool to see. I think like Howie Roseman and the rest of this Eagles front office plan ahead for life after Jason Kelce. And like, that's what these like good teams that sustain success over multiple years do, is they're constantly seeing what they have to do from a depth perspective and planning 3-4 years out in the future, while other teams will do this like win now type, kind of moves when their job is on the line.
Yeah. And there's like a quiet confidence in towing the line between I'm going to revamp for the future. We'll talk here, I think, next about they took Jalen Hurts in the draft, which just seems almost crazy at the 53rd pick, but it's worked out really, really well. Kind of towing that line between I want to win right now and I want to maximize my ability, but I know if I sell out my future, that's going to be as bad. And so how do I toe that line without being mired in kind of the middle? So let's do it. Let's talk about the quarterback here. Jalen Hurts, just a pretty great story. 53rd pick overall, coming in, was in Alabama, got benched in the national championship game, sat for a year behind Tua, and then went to Oklahoma, had a great year, got drafted, even though he was maybe an unconventional prospect. And the Eagles have really set him up for success as a quarterback here. So before we talk about him specifically, talk to me about the draft pick, Tej. Like, how crazy is it that the Eagles, having Carson Wentz, who was a fine quarterback at the time, felt like they needed to use this much draft capital, a second-round pick, on Jalen Hurts?
Mm-hmm. I think the Eagles, it's easy to say in hindsight, but at the time, a lot of analytics people like this pick because they basically played out the Monty Hall problem where you're picking, from three doors where one is a car and the other two are goats. And when they took Jalen Hurts in the second round, they're basically saying that they're not 100% sure what they have behind one of those doors, and they want to switch the door to the other side because they feel like having that 1 in 2 chance gives them a better chance of finding something than the 1 in 3 chance than if they just stuck with the original door. And that's why you kind of do this type of stuff, because they were looking at it from a perspective of, we have Carson Wentz making top of the market, top 5 quarterback money, and kind of his surplus value from that perspective. Or we could have Jalen Hurts taking up 0.5% of the cap with a second round contract that he's going to have, and how much surplus value will he provide in that aspect. And we can't be 100% confident that Carson Wentz will be a franchise quarterback in this league for years to come. So, even though Eagles fans at the time gave, or 80% of them on their SB Nation blog gave them an F for this pick, it's worked out really well for him because it was just a really good understanding of the uncertainty that is in football in general, but especially at the quarterback position.
Okay, let me push back on the Monty Hall and put you on the spot for a minute. We didn't talk about this. I'm just tossing this right at you here. But okay, there's kind of the joke of the meme about, do you want I think it's from a Family Guy episode, but I'm not 100% sure about this. But it's like, do you want the prize of the boat, or do you want the mystery box? And it's like, oh, I want the mystery box because it could even be a boat. How is the Eagles taking Jalen Hurts different than, let me take a flyer on a prospect because that prospect could even be Carson Wentz? What's kind of different about their approach that made it smart to kind of pad at a key position?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, love that clip, and I'm glad you brought this up. So, like, they kind of approached this, if we're sticking with that analogy, by having the boat already and taking the mystery box on top of that, because they, could have felt like confident enough to roll with Carson Wentz if they had to, but they wanted that second option there just in case things kind of went off the rails, and they felt like they had the planning and the ability to be able to do that.
Yeah, and you think about what's the probability that Carson Wentz is going to give you the sufficient play that is going to get your team where you need to go, and what's the probability that Jalen Hurts would do that? You add those up. Okay, I've got a quarterback between those two, and it worked out really, really well. Tej, I'm itching to talk about Jalen Hurts in college because I love it. I see Zach Rogers in the comments just said, I was surprised Hurts dropped until an R2. Should have been a round 1 pick. A little of that is probably hindsight because of the way he was used in college, but definitely undervalued. And I think his style of play is a little bit just a little bit different than you think of your prototypical kind of pro style quarterback. Tej, I'm sure you're aware, Oklahoma basically ran the triple option with Jalen Hurts when he switched over. So he ran so much more when he moved to Oklahoma under Lincoln Riley from Alabama. He had 49 scrambles at Oklahoma his last year, compared to 39 the last year he started at Alabama, but he had double the attempts. So designed rushing was something that he just never did at all at Alabama, and they completely increased that totally. What's so interesting about that, Tej, that I think is super important, and maybe some advanced stats we can tie in here with the NFL, a lot more of those runs for Jalen Hurts in college were kind of power short yardage situations. In 2017 at Alabama, he had 35 runs of 10 or more yards on just 76 attempts total, right? In 2019, he had 45 runs of 10 or more yards on 139 attempts, but he had 49 first downs in 2017, 76 first downs in 2019. So a lot of words there to say what happened is his attempts went way up. his first downs went way up, and his explosive runs stayed constant. So they found a way to say, hey, there's this whole facet to Jalen Hurts' game that we're not exploring. Let's use that. And the Eagles, I hope you're going to bear this out with the stats for me here, but the Eagles have done that very well by setting him up for success to convert those short power situations, to make those straightforward RPO throws, and say, hey, there's a dimension to Jalen Hurts that might not fit in kind of the cookie cutter ideal of a prototypical NFL quarterback, but someone with a head on their shoulders who knows what they're doing can really maximize this here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think the Eagles coaching staff specifically have done a tremendous job at understanding Hurts's abilities and kind of what he provides as a rusher this year. The Eagles have the biggest standard deviation of neutral pass rate on a game-to-game basis this year. And that's
okay, wait, I'm gonna push on that. Tell me that in layman's terms.
So they have the biggest spread between their pass rates in every single game this year. So if you look at kind of the differences from the middle of their pass rate, like you could take like the median or something, and or if you even looked at like a box plot and you looked at kind of the ranges between the top of the box plot and the bottom of the box plot, the Eagles would have the biggest kind of difference between their pass rates on a game-to-game basis. And that's because this coaching staff understands a really, really good job of when's it going to be a Jalen Hurts rushing game, when's it going to be a Jalen Hurts passing game, and they can kind of look at the positions or that they're going against on defense and kind of see that based on what they're able to do with a lot of their game planning abilities.
Yeah, and not that, college doesn't translate directly, but looking at the rush rate over expected, every year in college, Jalen Hurts, the offense that he ran a little bit more just because they had that dimensionality for Jalen Hurts to incorporate that. So 1.3%, right? Again, rush rate over expected. Let's take into account down, distance, yard line, game state, and say how often does the average team run in this situation. Jalen Hurts' first two Alabama teams ran 1.3 percentage points more, 2.8 percentage points more, and then at Oklahoma, 3.6 percentage points more than the average team. So definitely moving the ball and giving them that versatility to say, if the pass game is not working, again, I can kind of unlock this other dimension of this offense, and the flexibility there is super impressive, honestly.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, that's why I think as Hurts works more and more with the coaching staff, that's the benefit of having a rushing quarterback. And then on top of that, Hurts has just gotten better from an efficiency perspective. Each year he's played football kind of on a scale where we've been able to watch it. When he started in 2016 and I'm sure you can attest to this, to start as a true freshman at Alabama is very, very impressive, but he ranked 41st in QBR that year, then moved up to 7th the next year. Then transferred to Oklahoma, finished second in Heisman voting behind Joe Burrow in 2019 and finished 4th in QBR that year. And then as the graph shows on the screen here, each year in the league, he's gotten better as well. So we've seen this for 7 straight years now that Jalen Hurts continually is getting better and more efficient at playing football. He had a positive EPA, but was still below average his rookie season. That's moved up to slightly above average last year, and then top 5 this year.
And on this, so again, this isn't going to be great for our audio only listeners, but we have this graph up here and we can kind of talk about it. You can see the distribution, the spread of the distribution in 2020 is so much crazier. And so I'd almost not even knock his rookie year because he was still positive EPA. And you see there's a lot of outliers that are all presumably experienced quarterbacks who weren't hurt as much by not getting those offseason reps with those teams. That kind of happened in 2020 and explain a lot of that variation. And then as the distribution tightens in 2021, he moves above average. And then in 2022, of course, it increases again there as well. So his adaptability, along with the Eagles' adaptability, I think is an underrated skill in football generally, to know what you have and be able to employ it effectively. And it looks like the Eagles have gotten better at that every single year.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And when we move on to receiving talent here and kind of look at how the Eagles have built that up, that's another reason I think for his jump is because they went out and they drafted Devontae Smith in 2020, a year after missing on the Jalen Reagor draft pick. And so like that's Howie Roseman understanding the sunk cost fallacy that I want you to talk about here in a second. But then they also got an extra first round pick in the Devontae Smith trade, where they traded from 6 to 12 and then just sent a 4th round pick to move back up to 10 to draft Devontae Smith in 2020. And Devontae Smith might not be as good as Jalen Waddle, but you'd rather have Devontae Smith plus an extra first than Jalen Waddle. And then they use that extra first from the Devontae Smith trade to trade for A.J. Brown. And so this trade allowed Jalen Hurts to feel more comfortable throwing over the middle of the field, allowing him to become one of the better deep ball passers in the NFL, and just overall gave him a bigger room for error.
Absolutely. You talk about gravity, I think is so important in defense and like the attention commanded. Brown and Smith combined for about 56% of Philadelphia's targets this season. Having two guys, Devonta Smith was 27%. So just to say how much they were really, really involved kind of equally with different styles, obviously being very different body types and very different receiver styles, gives just this kind of confusing gravity for defenses to have to account for on the offensive side of the ball. So this is amazing, right? Amazing they have these two guys, especially because I don't think it's unfair to say that the Eagles potentially missed out on one of the best wide receiver prospects in recent history. They drafted Jalen Reagor out of TCU, and just a pick before, maybe a couple picks before, Justin Jefferson, who went to Minnesota. You've seen the video of the Minnesota front office kind of celebrating, and that's a wasted first round pick. Like, I don't mean to be harsh about Reagor, about a player or the situation, but like looking back at what they've done with that was a wasted first round pick. And they were able to come back from it by saying, hey, I'm not going to continue to invest resources in this negative value asset, right? I've got to move on. I've got to say what I spent is in the past. You talked about sunk cost fallacy and said, either I can keep paying into this mistake and making it worse, or I can cut it now and just go forward. And again, that's a very decisive move by the front office to say, we're gonna get away from this and we're gonna go get the wide receiver that we need in having Brown and having Smith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a great point. Is some other teams could have waited another year to kind of see if it was going to work with Reagor, but I think they just kind of understood that what they had in him and that it was time to move on, and they go out and get Devontae Smith, which I want to ask you about. Do you think that Devontae Smith was according to the stats, I think you could make the argument like the best receiver in college football history, perhaps, like, or did he have the best season in college football history? And like that could have been like a big factor of the Eagles draft models when they went to go get him at number 10 overall.
It's certainly hard to argue against his season being anything other than incredible, especially because it was short. 15 touchdowns of 15 games is, that's just regular season. And so, yeah, you have 23 touchdowns in 23 games for Smith there. Just absolutely incredible. The volume that they had. I think that we certainly need to append our models and append our kind of era adjustments when we're talking about the COVID year, but I'm certainly not going to penalize him for being exceedingly excellent in a year where there was high volatility. 1,856 yards, 15.9 yards per reception, caught 80% of the targets that were tossed at him, and 10.7 ADOT. So just down the field, getting the ball all over the place and making the end zone. It's hard to look at that anomaly, and you kind of think about this in a Bayesian framework, like, what's the probability that he's not an elite receiver given that he put up a season like this? And that becomes exceedingly small. So it makes a lot of sense that he went so high. And I think in a lot of ways, he's what they wanted Reagor to be, just talking about like body types and being, 6'0", 170. He's a little taller than Jalen Reagor, but generally saying, hey, we know we need this kind of this type of receiver in our arsenal. And the one we have, we don't think works. Let's go get an upgrade. And I think that was super aggressive and has clearly worked out really, really well.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And yeah, it's what led them to have these two receivers here that have been awesome. I think doing kind of this exercise or anyone who's looked at the Eagles receiver as a whole, they basically have every spot filled with like a high-end quality starter or all-pro or pro bowler or some type, really, except for wide receiver 3. I think Quez Watkins is fine, but you're not going to be like completely stacked at every spot. And then to kind of round out the receiving talent, Dallas Goedert got drafted in the 5th round in 2018. So again, it goes back to like people being low on Howie Roseman during kind of like a dry spell of bad drafting, especially with the Rieger pick and the JJ Arcega Whiteside pick. But drafting is pretty random. And at the end of the day, the Eagles process is sound for their drafting. And I think that's what has led them to this spot. As we transition over to the defense, we can see that so many of these pieces on their defense have kind of come together as well, from either giving money to defensive linemen, which they've done and with extensions and some players that used to be on the Super Bowl roster, and then kind of just throwing a lot of pieces at their secondary. So starting with the defensive line, specifically, the Eagles signed Josh Sweat this offseason. He was taken in the 4th round by the Commanders. Brandon Graham is from the roster that won the Super Bowl, has been really good for them there as well. And then you have Javon Hargrave, who is making $17 million this year, the highest paid player on the Eagles roster. And then you also have Hassan Reddick, which was another signing there as well. And all of these guys have been phenomenal for them. The Eagles lead the league in sack rate and pressure rate. Their defensive line has been really, really good this year. And it's kind of like a melding of different strategies to get defensive linemen, but they've taken a lot of shots at this position. I think it's worked out for them well.
I feel like we're just repeating ourselves all the way over, but like they also took Jordan Davis. And remember, there was kind of like a pseudo analytics backlash against Jordan Davis because, quote unquote, he only took, 13% of the snaps. And so his usage wasn't very high. And despite the fact he filled a very specific role on a team that played a lot of garbage time and all that. And again, they just had a very good sense of what they wanted and what they needed and took him there. And just again, for all the kind of what you just mentioned of like the backlash of like, oh, maybe they haven't drafted so well. Maybe they're not good at this. I feel like they've just taken a lot of swings and some of them have missed, but because they've taken swings, you kind of hear about the misses more than you focus on the hits, just because they're a little bit of an outlier overall.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why like you trade for Robert Quinn midway through the season, and he's at an older age where you don't know if he's necessarily going to contribute, but it's good to have that depth there. Or you sign Ndamukong Suh halfway through the season. He's only playing a couple snaps for you a game, but has been really impactful in that regard. And yeah, you mentioned the Jordan Davis pick. Like it's the combination that the Eagles have done with planning ahead, but also keeping this roster really competitive has been very impressive, I think. And that's why you're able to get this rotation of pass rushers and run defense that has been really impressive for them this year, especially from a pass rushing perspective, I think.
Yeah, very, very disruptive in the pass game. I'll say, just looking at EPA per play from this year to last year, they were 23rd in EPA per dropback on defense last season in 2021. The Eagles were. And this season, they are literally first, negative 0.167. So I don't know if there's any more kind of proof is in the pudding or something working out than it being that evident of the improvement they've made on defense this offseason through not only the pass rushers, but also how the secondary is kind of coalesced there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like the secondary is the same thing, right? Like all these different pathways to build up their secondary. Like when we had the Buccaneers Super Bowl roster a couple of years ago, they had a stretch for 2 years where they just drafted really, really well in their secondary. And that's what led them to have all these players, which is good. I mean, it worked out for them. But the Eagles approach it with different paths. You trade for Darius Slay when he was available to every team and get him for a really good deal a couple of years ago. You trade for CJ Gardner-Johnson when he was tired of playing slot corner in New Orleans. You convert him to safety where he ended up having a ton of interceptions this year as well. You signed James Bradbury, who's had a really, really good season on kind of a one-year deal here with the Eagles when, again, every other team could have had him. And then you kind of had Reed Blankenship fill in when you needed to in the secondary, who was, a rookie this year as well. So it's all these different pieces kind of coming together to lead them to, like you mentioned, like the number one pass defense in the league. And that's like, again, like what we said about defensive linemen, where you're just taking so many shots over and over. You can kind of just keep doing that at these types of positions and hoping it's going to work out, because like our friend Eric Eager, it likes to mention like defense is a weak link system. So if you're taking like 20 different players you think could start, and then you get the best 11 out there, that's better than just focusing all your resources into 2 or 3 players on defense and letting offenses kind of pick on the weak links.
Yeah, there's a really great, if you're nerdy, there's a really great paper. Guy just recently won the Nobel Prize in economics for looking at the O-ring theory of economic development. O-ring referring to the faulty piece on the Challenger rocket that exploded, and the idea that like success is kind of a series of interdependent processes, and defense is certainly like that. If you have 2 stars and 10 guys who can't tie their shoes, you can't defend anybody. And the Eagles have done a really good job of saying we're going to continue to troll for depth until we have the sufficient minimum level at every position. And again, obviously paid off. Tej, we're about halfway through, which is great timing, 30 minutes here. And you just talked about trades. So I think I'm going to take us away from the Eagles, unless you have anything else there. And I'm just going to throw out there first, we have to talk about the Tyreek Hill trade, because the Chiefs, evidently mortgaged their future, according to some pundits, completely made this mistake of getting rid of their top talent. And they're back here in the Super Bowl and look pretty great. So let's talk about the Tyreek Hill trade and the Chiefs, and then we'll talk about receivers and get to Pat Mahomes and all that fun stuff as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, again, like I was looking at this today just to kind of remind myself of the amount of picks that they got. So the Chiefs had the option of trading Tyreek Hill to the Jets for just their first round pick this year, which ended up turning into the number 10 pick, or they could have traded it for a first rounder, a second rounder, 2 fourths, and a 6th from the Dolphins. And that's the one that they ended up trading with. If you look at the Fitzgerald Spielberger chart, they ended up making the right decision now that we know what the Jets pick is. But on top of that, Tyreek Hill's contract that he ended up getting from the Dolphins is essentially $83 million over the next 3 years. And the 4th year is probably going to end up being voided. So when you look at the resources that the Chiefs got from a draft pick perspective, but also factor in the amount of money that they're being saved, you can see why they wanted to go through with this trade. And I think a lot of people, if not everyone, thought that they would take a step back from kind of this aspect of not having one of the best receivers in football. But I think they understood how good Mahomes is and how those resources are going to free up other areas of roster development to kind of get back to this level where they again have the best passing offense in the league.
I am not prepared, Tej, to make a referendum on the Bengals versus the Chiefs in history, right? I don't want to make a forward-looking take on that, but I will just comment that it does look like, given that you have a great quarterback, I think I'm very comfortable saying that Pat Mahomes and Joe Burrow are great quarterbacks. One of them is kind of, hey, we're going to let our great quarterback be protected and have a great scheme and throw it to anyone. And the other one is kind of, hey, we're going to not really protect our quarterback well and hope that he can just chuck it up to a great receiver. And I think that in certain moments, you definitely see the merits of the Chiefs' ways, because so much of their game plan is we're gonna put the onus on Pat Mahomes creating, not Pat Mahomes surviving in the pocket, but being able to create and throw into these guys that I don't want to call this kind of a junkyard of a wide receiving room, but it's certainly unconventional, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I think it goes back to, and I tweeted this today for anyone who saw, like, it goes back to the scene from Moneyball where they're kind of like, we don't have to replace the hits that just one player provided. We just need to make it up in the aggregate with the new resources that we have from not being able to sign him. And that's what it is. You're right. Like Juju Smith-Schuster, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, Justin Watson, Sky Moore, like they're not seen as these like high-end receivers or anything, but they got 933 yards out of Juju. They got 687 out of MVS, 315 out of Justin Watson. And those are 3 free agents that they're able to sign because of this trade. They drafted Sky Moore in the 3rd round because they had extra draft picks for him. So in the aggregate, they were able to make up what you kind of had with Mahomes. But as Zach Rogers is is mentioning here in the chat, like this isn't a thing that I think other teams can replicate because they don't have Mahomes, but the Chiefs were able to do it because of what they do have.
Yes, and one, of course, we'll add the caveat with the Moneyball kind of direct parallel of like it's not one at bat, right? Like I can't necessarily, I have to have those guys on the field at the same time, and I can only throw those put those guys on the same field in the same configuration in certain ways. So a little bit of like finagling and kind of fungibility with your resources there, but still the idea of I don't need one great wide receiver for a ridiculous amount of money if I can put a couple on the field, create some extra depth, get these guys fresh, knowing that maybe three pretty good receivers all being fresh throughout the game are going to be better than one receiver. But yes, we're absolutely bearing the lead here because the Chiefs do have an elite wide receiver. He's just called a tight end because he's a little bit heavy set in Travis Kelce. He's paid like a tight end. He gets recognized like a tight end, but I mean, he's very obviously a receiver, very obviously maybe the second most important piece on their offense with behind Mahomes, obviously. But Kelce is just absolutely a monster at the position, and is doing something that I think is redefining kind of the way the football is played in terms of these hybrid athletes where a linebacker can't cover Kelce. He's too slow. And a safety, if he gets physical at all, is going to get beat. What do? How do you cover him? Completely changes the game, to speak of gravity again.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a great point. Like you mentioned, like Travis Kelce is getting $8.9 million this year. It's a great value from the Chiefs to get, basically a high-end wide receiver one when you look at yards per out run or just yards in general for tight end money. And then like on top of like Travis Kelce, like him being on the field, like they're technically in 12 personnel when like Noah Gray or Blake Bell is also in the field, but it really is 11 personnel. So you can kind of get into like some like scheme advantages there based on like how the defense counters it, like you mentioned.
But Kelsey's versatile. I feel like he's a fine enough blocker that also you can kind of like lure teams into thinking like, is it 12? I don't know. Like I can't just position match you. I can't just personnel match you there. Tej, fun fact. Travis Kelce is fourth in targets in the NFL this year behind Jefferson, Devontae Adams in Las Vegas, and Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill has 17 more targets than Travis Kelce. So, I mean, he's every bit as productive as your top wide receivers. Stephon Diggs, CeeDee Lamb, Deontay Johnson are all right there, right behind him in terms of targets. He's as involved as any of these wide receiver ones. And again, they're getting him for pennies.
Yeah, I know. It's very impressive kind of management from the Chiefs here. And I think something that's interesting, and I want to hear your thoughts on this, is knowing where Travis Kelce is, where he's been playing at this high of a level for so long, but is 33 years old now. And I don't think his career has been as physical as Rob Gronkowski, but we kind of saw, Rob Gronkowski's body like not be able to hold up for as long time because tight end is a very, very physical position. Where do you kind of think Kelce is able to keep this level of play up for? And what do you think it'll look like when he starts to decline at an age that he gets to eventually?
Okay, so one thing I'll say immediately, I don't have the stats for that I'd be interested in is kind of when he's on the field and when he's involved. I think is he playing like those 3rd and 2 situations? Is he is the selection of when he's on the field changing to kind of minimize that physical load and the chance that he takes a hit? Like even I start to think about things like, oh, if it's 3rd and 18. Maybe I'm going to pull him off the field just because like interception or something weird happens. I don't want him in a position to be vulnerable or have to block or make a tackle. I don't know. I don't know what they're doing with that. I don't have that available to me. One thing I do have available is contested targets and contested targets caught. And I'll go ahead and say I think this is a poor proxy, but I think it's a proxy for kind of how physical he is over the middle of the field and what they're trying to do to minimize that. And his contestable targets, in 2018, had 24, 21, and 19, 10 last year, and then up to 19 this year. But he's caught way fewer of them. So kind of in the heyday, 2018, 2019, He caught 62.5 and 52.4 of those kind of contested targets, those physical balls where someone's on him. This season, 36.8. So again, I don't want to make a mountain out of that, but just saying, if I'm thinking about usage, if I'm thinking about decline, I'm thinking about how can I get the ball to my man and let him go down? How do I get him open and not get hit or not have to make a physical play in a high leverage situation where maybe his body is out of position and could potentially get him hurt? Another thing to look at is his average depth of target was over 9 in 17, 18, 19, and 20. It's been 7.5, 7.6. Get the ball out a little quicker, get it to him in favorable positions, let him rumble for a few yards and then go down. So again, he doesn't have to take those hits in those compromising positions. I think both of those are what I'd be interested in, is kind of the usage and how much kind of friction or traffic he's being asked to play in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, those are great stats. I'm glad we got a little bit of insight there as well. And if the Chiefs are doing some of that, I think it's very smart on the coaching staff. So we've kind of alluded to this a couple times here, but you can't really talk about the Chiefs and their roster building without bringing up Patrick Mahomes, who again was traded up by the Chiefs. They traded the number 27 overall, number 91 overall in that draft, and then their next year's first to get Mahomes. And this is why we say, like, trading up usually isn't good. And it's usually minus EV, except if you're doing it for a quarterback. And that's where we can see it have value. So as someone who follows the Big 12 as closely as you do, I want to hear, what do you think were the traits or kind of the stats that made Mahomes so desirable, and then now has led to him to have this very long career, as we see here, where he's ranked top 3 in EPA per play every season of his career in the NFL?
Yeah, so on one level, I think it was the idea that, I mean, Texas Tech had a terrible defense when Pat Mahomes was there. They were having to score 60 and 70 and 80 points to win games, and he was doing it. He was just creating at a level that no one was, even as his surroundings weren't very good. I think that a couple of things that are really interesting about Pat Mahomes and kind of where he dialed in as a player, his average depth of target decreased every year. 11.0 his first year, 8.3 his second year, and then I misspoke, and then it was 9.3 his last year, but came down substantially from that first year. And I think that helps kind of exemplify his pre-snap processing, not needing to wait so much to figure out what's going on after the snap in that air raid offense. I talked about rush rate over expected for Hurts. For Mahomes, it was negative 13.2, negative 10.4, negative 16.6. That was air raid in every definition of the air raid, just chucking the ball a lot. And with those reps, I think that if you're a little timid, you're going to be trying to throw the ball a little bit longer, trying to wait for something to happen rather than attacking. That decreased average depth of target, certainly reflective of him getting the ball to the right place, knowing where he wants to go with it, reading the defense well. That's backed up by his time to throw. 2.82 his first year, 2.81, and then 2.77. Stays a little constant, a slight decline, but mostly constant as he's bringing that average depth of target. He's processing, he's moving, and he's finding those guys. He's being a little bit more aggressive. What's interesting is that he really did very much. 64 and 63 attempts in his last 2 years in college. But what I think that a lot of people like, and shout out to our friend Kevin Cole of Unexpected Points, who has talked about how quarterbacks creating value in avoiding sacks is kind of underrated, because sure, it might be a negative play if you scramble or throw an incompletion, but if you avoid the sack, you've kind of avoided the worst negative play, and you're able to raise that floor of your offense, which is very important. Pat Mahomes, 13.7 pressure to sack his first year, 10.2, 10.2. Very constant, very elusive in terms of dealing with pressure and still being aggressive, increasing those volume numbers as he's mitigating that pressure. So I think that Pat Mahomes, as a prospect, looked like a guy who was kind of dialing in throughout college, even amidst some bad circumstances, was learning how to process pre-snap reads and was able to kind of create as opposed to react on the football field. And we saw that in real time. I think that's in no small part the reason that the Chiefs were so aggressive in going to get him.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I love everything you said there. And to kind of expand on a lot of that, I think something that's really important for quarterbacks, and kind of like when you're evaluating their stats, is like some quarterbacks just have to press more because they know that their defense isn't good. And I think seeing Mahomes have success when he had to press basically on every drive of his college career because he knew what his defense was going to do on the other end was important. And then there's so much noise in usage rates, and for him to be used as much as he was in college, it was part of the scheme, but it was also probably the coaches kind of understanding of the arm that Mahomes had and his ability to avoid sacks, like you mentioned, where it wouldn't completely kill the drive if the offensive line let up some pressure and all that stuff. I think was part of the reason for that. And then when you look at Mahomes from kind of like where he is now, he currently has the 5th highest average per year contract in the league. And Lamar Jackson, Justin Herbert, and Joe Burrow are going to sign extensions this offseason that probably go over that. And Jalen Hurts could be included in that group as well, depending on what the Eagles do. So we're looking at Mahomes' contract here where he only has a $35 million cap hit this year. And then he's going to be somewhere around the end of the top 10 from a value perspective as one of the best values in the whole league. And it really started with getting that draft there. You're able to win the 1 Super Bowl on the rookie contract. And now you kind of have the second wind of the Chiefs where they were able to build up this roster with Mahomes making more money, but still getting that really long 10-year deal where he won't be making top end money every single year of his contract.
Yeah, they're in a really good spot. And again, can you overpay for a Patrick Mahomes? I don't know.
Yeah, I see. That's the thing is like, I don't really think so. And like, that's something that is sometimes brought up as a hypothetical on Twitter or something, is like, how many draft picks would you trade Mahomes for? There wouldn't be enough first round picks in the 4-year span that you're allowed to trade draft picks for, right?
If I had certainty that Pat Mahomes was going to be Pat Mahomes, yeah, I think all of them, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know what I wouldn't trade for him. Yeah,
exactly. But so let's move on to the running back room here, and I kind of want to talk about like the nerds like to say that running backs don't matter, but that's kind of a little bit of a misnomer. What we really mean when we say something like that is you can kind of find running backs easier than other positions. And so what that's meant for the Chiefs here is they draft Clyde Edwards-Helaire in the first round because he was the feature running back for the best offense in college football history with 2019 LSU. And Edwards-Helaire has been injured this year, but when he's been on the field, he hasn't been as good as advertised. I think his career hasn't been great. But then you have Isaiah Pacheco, a 7th round rookie that was splitting carries at Rutgers last year. And now you have this rusher that you can count on that has been getting some really tough yards for them in these playoffs. And then Mahomes finished with the 2nd most running yards of any Chief this year. So you kind of have that dynamic where Pacheco was good for them, Mahomes, and then you can kind of mix in like McKinnon and Edwards-Helaire from there.
Dude, I'm kind of sick looking at. I just got distracted and went to the draft board to see who was still on the board when they drafted Clyde at 32 there for the Chiefs. T. Higgins, DeAndre Swift, Jonathan Taylor. Yeah, there's a lot there in that 2nd round that maybe if they could do that again, they would think differently about that. And yeah, I think the running backs point is really important. You know, as we're doing all this nerdy stuff, it's important to communicate super well. And the way that I always say it is like, past a certain threshold of running back talent, running back success is a lot more dependent on scheme and opportunity and usage than it is individual efforts. And in college, I think that threshold of talent is much higher. So there's certain guys where you're just like, hey, Bijan Robinson is a dude, right? Derrick Henry is a dude. I don't care what you do with him in college, he's going to be great. In the NFL, it's certainly a lot more opportunity invested or opportunity related. I think my biggest comment about Pacheco is that he runs very hard. And I'm very, very interested in, like, an off-season study would be, if I had tracking data, how could I quantify like how much a running back lowers his head to the risk of injury? Because I feel like every time he runs the ball, I'm worried that he's going to just throw something out of joint there. But he's been a great example of a guy can come in and know the scheme and be past that certain threshold of talent and be more than good enough for this team to thrive.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think like the best description I've seen of Pacheco is like he runs like he's like really angry at the ground, which I think is good and kind of goes into your point there as well. Do you want to talk Chiefs offensive line or move on to their defense here?
Can I make one more? We're probably lingering, but can I make one more statement?
Yeah, for sure.
One thing that's interesting is that if I'm correct about this, Pacheco is really, really good in like checkdowns. So you saw like in the
Mhm.
Bengals game, he was able to say, "I know what Pat Mahomes is going to do. I'm going to get open and kind of move." I do think that the idea that Clyde Edwards-Helaire could be a really good checkdown running back was kind of supported in college football. He had 48 targets, caught 43 of those. 7.9 yards per reception on an average depth of target of 0.1 yards. So I
Mhm.
think that's as much as I want to dunk on like picking a running back in the first round, and as much as I believe it was a mistake, even in hindsight, I do think that there was at least a modicum of
Yeah.
logical process behind it to say,
Mhm.
hey, this guy is very valuable in our offense, as evidenced by them winning against the Bengals because they had Pacheco there to take the shorter passes. And Hilaire, at least um, for LSU in that 2019 season, showed flashes of being able to be that. It just, for whatever reason, hasn't translated, and there's been injuries and all that as well.
Mhm.
But I do want to speak up in defense of him just a little bit. I do understand a little bit of the logic there, I
Mhm.
think.
Yeah. No, definitely agree. I mean, Edwards-Helaire was amazing with that LSU team, and like Alex is mentioning in the chat here, like those angle routes that he would take past the first down marker were really special, and it kind of went into this whole like thing where you couldn't obviously defend every weapon that LSU had. So if we were to go back and kind of look at see how defenses were playing them and seeing how much focus they were putting on Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, and Terrence Marshall Jr. versus Clyde Edwards-Helaire, I think that would be interesting as well.
Yeah, I just thought like Oklahoma just looked tired trying to defend everybody because as soon as you tried to get those receivers, you had uh, Edwards Hilaire coming in underneath, and just
Mhm.
so much versatility. And I think gravity matters a whole lot with that.
Yeah.
Okay, I could pontificate about the 2019 LSU Tigers for a very long time, Tej. Let's talk about the linemen really quick, and then we'll touch on the defense because I think Eric would get mad at both of us if we didn't talk about Chris Jones before the end of this roster composition podcast. So um, the offensive line, Orlando Brown, change of scenery, change of scheme, but seems to have worked out pretty well for them at left tackle.
Yeah, I always like when the trade happened. I remember talking about this, and I thought it was interesting that Orlando Brown was going to go from the run heaviest team in the league to the pass heaviest team, basically. And he bet on himself this year, not taking the extension that the Chiefs gave him, and was franchise tagged. And I think he hasn't played as well as he probably wanted to, and probably lost value. So it'll be really interesting to see what they do from that perspective, because their other tackle, Andrew Wiley, is also on a 1-year deal this year as well. So they could potentially have two tackle spots that are open. But when you have an interior offensive line that's playing as well as the Chiefs offensive line is playing, with Joe Thuney, he's the sixth highest paid Chief this year, and then Creed Humphrey, second round pick last year in his second year, one of the best centers in the league, and then Trey Smith at right guard, who was a sixth round pick in 2021, same graph as Creed Humphrey, who's also played pretty well. I think that should make it a little bit easier for whatever they do with the tackle position, but I do think it will be interesting from that perspective to kind of see like how they handle the situation there as well. But they've done a good job building up this offensive line after that Super Bowl against the Buccaneers, where they kind of vowed that they'll never be that embarrassed again at that position. So I agree with you that it has worked out pretty well in that aspect so far.
And as we know, health in football is certainly something you can sort of affect, but you need some help for that as
Mhm.
well. And this season, looking at PFR's approximate value, which is just basically snaps times how much they scored, but a good way to say kind of how involved are you. All five linemen are right there at the top. You've got all four or five of them played 17 games, I believe, and so a really consistent unit as well. Which again, we talked about Hurts in the creation and the extension of plays. You also need that for Mahomes, and so being able to get those reps in games, learn how to do that well, has been super important for them along the offensive line. So that consistency and health, I think, is pretty hard to. It's pretty easy to underappreciate, but I think it's crucial to their success this season.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think offensive line continuity is really really important, and kind of like again like what you we mentioned earlier with Jeff Stoutland and how good he's done with the Eagles offensive line. Andy Heck has been really good for the Chiefs offensive line as well. We can see development from multiple of these players. So offensive line coach is something that again Eric has done a lot of research into, and it seems to be one of the more undervalued aspects of when talking about these teams and kind of the development is like getting a good veteran offensive line coach like the Patriots had one throughout their whole dynasty is like something that can be super important for these teams here.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. All right. I'm looking at timing. We're kind of hitting that close to an hour point. I think we've got about 4 or 5 minutes here. Tej, I'm going to let you speed run. Talk to me about this defense. How did we get to the Chiefs having a defense that has been impressive in its feistiness? I think it's improved in both passing and rushing EPA from last year, and it's certainly helped them get to where they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, again, like it's kind of crazy to look at how young this defense is outside of the majority of the defensive line. So, like, obviously, Chris Jones, one of the best, if not the best, interior defensive lineman in football this year. You have Frank Clark, who you traded a first round pick for, who you haven't been able to get great value back on. But outside of those two, you have basically an entire defense playing on a rookie contract or as a rookie this year. You have George Karlaftis, who was a first round pick this past year, Jalen Watson at cornerback, who starts for them and is also a rookie, and then Trent McDuffie, their other first round pick that they got through the Tyreek Hill trade, playing at nickelback for them this year as well. But then you have all these other rookies who have kind of rotated into the lineup in and out throughout the year, depending on injuries or kind of need for them. Leo Chanel from Wisconsin at middle linebacker, who's rotated in, Brian Cook at free safety, and Joshua Williams at corner. And like, it's just really impressive job, I think, by Steve Spagnuolo, the defensive coordinator, for being able to get all these rookies in there as well. And then like your main linebacker, Nick Bolton, is on a rookie contract, and he was just drafted, a year ago. So I think that's what's been really impressive about these rookies. And for the graph that people watching on YouTube here can see, the Chiefs have had the third most 2022 draft class approximate value from Pro Football Reference this season, behind the Seahawks and the Jets. So they've been playing the rookies a lot. And they all haven't necessarily been great, but they've been getting usage out of them, and they've gotten better throughout the year, which has been really important.
Yeah, I think it's just instructive on itself to look at the teams that are around the Chiefs in terms of rookie usage and understand the disparate outcomes. Because you've got the Seahawks, and this is offense and defense, but the Seahawks whose defense had some issues, the Jets, who are a flawed team, the Texans right behind the Chiefs, the Giants, the Packers, the Falcons, all flawed teams right around the Super Bowl, the AFC winners and Super Bowl participants, Kansas City there. So very impressive at how, like you said, they've integrated the rookies as well as given themselves the opportunity to integrate the rookies, acquiring that talent and getting the guys that they needed and wanted on that side of the ball.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point about those teams that have had the same kind of value generated from the rookies this year being more like rebuilding teams than the Chiefs in the middle of a Super Bowl run here as well. And like, I guess that's like kind of how you get to this level when you're paying Patrick Mahomes and Chris Jones $35 million and $29 million respectively. Like, when you have $64 million of your cap space going to two players, you could even include Orlando Brown with a $16 million franchise tag, or Frank Clark with the $14 million cap hit that he has this year as well. Like, you have a ton of money going to those, basically the star of your offense and the star of your defense. And you have to get these type of rotational players that take up less than 1% of your salary cap or just around there. And I think that's what the Chiefs were able to do this year. And what's made it so impressive is kind of some of Brett Veach's like decisions from that standpoint to get to this level.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I think we're going to hit an hour here. I think we're going to kind of start to wind this thing down. Any other tidbits, trivium, points of information we put in the notes that we didn't get to about either team that you wanted to make sure we hit, Tej, while we're here?
Yeah, I mean, again, like I think like if you kind of look at like the cap space, we just talked about the Chiefs cap base. I think like who the Eagles are paying, it becomes really interesting too. Like they're giving Lane Johnson third highest right tackle money in the league at 11 million. Darius Slay is getting 10 million. Brandon Graham is getting 9 million. Jason Kelsey is getting 8 million. But then what they did with the AJ Brown contract this year, where his cap it's only $6 million, and they kind of spread out the rest of the extension. Like that's really good by the Eagles. And the Eagles like cap, like if you ever like have some free time, go to Over the Cap and kind of look at like how many void years and how they like manipulate the salary cap, because like they keep kind of just rolling money into future years. And I think that's really interesting. And then the Chiefs kind of took it from a different perspective, where they could have chose to kind of roll Mahomes' bonus into next year and pushed it into the future. They chose to put it on this year specifically. So you can kind of see some of the similarities and differences between these two teams from a monetary perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that, because I think that was our whole purpose in this episode, like you said, was to kind of look at the macro perspective of, the on-field stuff matters, and a lot of this has to do with the on-field stuff of who's on field. But how did these teams get here? And we see kind of a tale of two approaches from these two teams, and they've paid off differently. They're in different positions, kind of looking forward, and the decisions they're going to have to make. Super fascinating kind of off-season conversation. But Tej, they are meeting in the Super Bowl next week. So what I think we're going to do is on Wednesday, we're going to get into the nitty gritty of the matchup. We'll have my game preview that we've been posting on Twitter. We have tons of graphs. Tej is posting a graph an hour almost on Twitter. They're just good content, kind of slicing and dicing. How many ways can we look at this game to kind of understand what's going on? So we'll get into the nuts and bolts of that on Wednesday, break down that matchup, again, talk more about that, take some questions and your thoughts about the game. If you're in the chat, would love to do that. Other than that, I think I'm good. Tej, are you good?
Yeah. Sorry, there are a couple of questions in the chat that we weren't able to offer.
Oh, I think there was one I saw about defensive coordinators that I was going to ask you, because I haven't kept tabs on that at all. But asking about the Broncos defensive coordinator went to the Panthers. Give us quick thoughts, and then we'll bounce on that.
Yeah. Thanks for this question, Amy. I think Evero decided not to stay in Denver because new coaching staff. I don't know if their ideas would have necessarily clashed or anything with Sean Payton, kind of what he wants to see from his defense. But I think that was a really good hire by Carolina. I think Evero did a really good job with the Broncos defense this year. There's a reason why he was even considered a head coaching candidate by most, I think. And I don't have any sources or anything on this. I think if I had to pick who would be the DC in Denver, if I had to bet on anyone, it would be Sean Desai. We saw him be the defensive coordinator with the Bears for Matt Nagy's last year. He has gotten really good, impressive reviews from his time in Seattle, and he does seem to be getting, I believe, a second interview with Denver. So I think they might end up going with him, but we'll have to see kind of what direction they decide to go in there. Desai kind of will bring a too high structure from the Vic Fangio tree that Evero kind of had there as well. So we can see that this defense was built to run a Vic Fangio too high, lighter boxes level defense. So Desai can kind of run with that if you were to get hired there.
Great answer. Awesome. This has been the Sumer Sports Show Super Bowl preview part 1. We will be back on Wednesday with part 2. Make sure that you follow us on Twitter. We're trying to get to 5K here just as a matter of personal vanity, build that up a little bit. So make sure you're following there. Make sure you're following on the on Twitter at Sumer Sports. Make sure you're following the YouTube. Thanks for all of you that have tuned in, and come back on Wednesday with questions about the teams on the field. We'll try and get as nerdy as that. Maybe we can bully Tej into pulling up some code and doing something live as well, and getting us some stats too. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see all of you on Wednesday.